I decided to enter the VIP limo at my father's funeral. At the door, the driver blocked me. When I told him I was the sole heir, he laughed and said, "Sir, the heir is already inside. There he is, popping champagne with the widow." He pointed to my wife's lover, so I decided to play along. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I never thought my father's funeral would become the stage for my greatest humiliation. At 57 years old, I believed I had experienced every possible betrayal life could offer. I was wrong. The black limousine sat gleaming in the cemetery parking lot, its windows tinted so dark they reflected the gray October sky like mirrors. My father, Harold, had specifically requested the VIP service for family members, and I walked toward it with what little dignity I had left after 3 days of viewing, condolences, and the suffocating presence of my wife Isabella's family. "Excuse me, sir." The driver stepped in front of me, his white-gloved hand raised like a traffic cop. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of polished appearance that screamed expensive funeral home training. "This vehicle is reserved for immediate family only." I stopped, blinking in confusion. The morning drizzle had started to seep through my black wool coat, and I could feel the dampness settling into my bones. "I am immediate family. I'm Richard Covington. Harold Covington was my father." The driver's eyebrows rose slightly, and then something awful happened. He smiled. Not the practiced, sympathetic smile I'd been seeing all week, but something genuine and amused. "Sir, I'm sorry, but the heir is already inside." He gestured toward the limousine with a theatrical flourish that made my stomach drop. "There he is, celebrating with the widow." Through the tinted glass, I could make out shapes moving inside. The faint sound of laughter drifted out, followed by what sounded distinctly like champagne bottles clinking together. My throat went dry as the driver leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That gentleman in there told us he inherited everything. Said the old man finally came to his senses about who really deserved the family fortune." The driver's eyes held a mixture of pity and entertainment. "You're welcome to wait outside, of course. I'm sure they'll let you ride in one of the regular cars." The world tilted sideways for a moment. 27 years of marriage, 57 years as Harold Covington's only son, and I was being barred from my own father's funeral limousine by a stranger who thought someone else was the rightful heir. I forced myself to peer through the darkened windows again. This time I could see more clearly. Isabella, my wife of 27 years, was nestled against a man I recognized immediately. Marcus Webb, her tennis instructor, the same Marcus Webb who had been giving her private lessons every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 6 years. The same Marcus Webb who Isabella swore was just a friend whenever I questioned their increasingly frequent text exchanges. But it wasn't just Isabella and Marcus celebrating inside my father's funeral limousine. Through the glass, I could see Isabella's mother, Helen, her perfectly styled silver hair catching the dim interior light as she raised what appeared to be a crystal champagne flute. Beside her sat James, Isabella's younger brother, the one who had spent the last decade making snide comments about my modest income and lack of ambition. They were actually toasting, at my father's funeral, in the limousine meant for grieving family members. "The heir," I repeated slowly, tasting the bitter irony of the words. "And they're celebrating." "Well, sir," the driver said, his tone now openly condescending, "I imagine it's been a difficult transition. Losing a parent is hard, but gaining financial security can certainly ease the burden." He glanced back at the limousine where another round of muffled laughter erupted. They seemed to be handling the grief quite well. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break. I'd felt things break before. This was different. This was the sound of something that had been hanging by a thread finally snapping free. For 6 years, I had ignored the signs. The late-night phone calls Isabella claimed were from her book club. The expensive new clothes that appeared in her closet, despite our modest budget. The way she flinched when I touched her, as if my hands were somehow distasteful. The family dinners where Helen would make pointed comments about men who couldn't provide properly for their wives, while James nodded in agreement. I had told myself it was my imagination. That grief over my father's declining health was making me paranoid. That 27 years of marriage meant something, even if that something had grown cold and brittle over time. But standing there in the cemetery parking lot, watching my wife celebrate with her lover while my father lay in his casket 50 yards away, I understood with perfect clarity that I had been living a lie. Not just about Isabella's faithfulness, but about everything. About my place in her life, about her family's tolerance of me, about the future I thought we were building together. The driver was still talking, something about alternative transportation arrangements and the importance of family harmony during difficult times. I nodded absently, my eyes fixed on the limousine where Isabella had just thrown her head back in laughter at something Marcus had whispered in her ear. 27 years. More than half my life spent with a woman who was now celebrating my father's death as if it were her birthday party. "You know what?" I said finally, my voice surprisingly steady. "That's perfectly fine. I'll find another way to get to the cemetery." The driver looked relieved. "I'm sure that's for the best, sir. These family situations can be quite complicated." I nodded, reaching into my coat pocket to pull out my phone. My fingers brushed against something unexpected, a thick envelope I didn't remember putting there. For a moment I hesitated. When had that gotten there? But before I could investigate further, the limousine door opened with a soft electronic hiss. Isabella stepped out first, her black designer dress clinging to her figure in a way that probably cost more than my monthly salary. At 52, she was still beautiful, still the woman who had turned heads at our wedding all those years ago. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her makeup was flawless despite the early morning hour. Marcus emerged behind her, his hand immediately finding the small of her back in a gesture so natural, so practiced, that it was obvious they'd been doing this for far longer than 6 years. He was younger than both of us, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of athletic build that came from years of professional tennis instruction, and the confidence that came from never having to worry about money. "Oh, Richard," Isabella said, her voice carrying that tone I'd grown to hate, the one that suggested surprise tinged with disappointment. "What are you doing out here? Shouldn't you be in one of the family cars?" Helen appeared in the limousine doorway, her pale blue eyes scanning me with the same expression she might use to examine something unpleasant on the bottom of her shoe. "Really, Richard, this is hardly the time to make a scene. Your father deserves dignity at his funeral, don't you think?" James emerged last, straightening his expensive suit as he looked me up and down. "The cars for extended family are over there," he said, pointing toward a row of modest black sedans. "I'm sure they'll have room for you." Extended family. I was extended family at my own father's funeral. The rain was falling harder now, and I could feel it soaking through my coat, chilling my skin. But something else was happening too, something that had been building for years, was finally reaching its breaking point. I looked at Isabella, really looked at her, and saw something in her eyes I'd been missing. Not guilt, not shame, not even pity. There was anticipation there, excitement. She was waiting for me to break down, to beg, to make a scene that would justify whatever story she'd already prepared about my emotional instability and unfitness as a husband. Instead, I smiled. It surprised me as much as it surprised her. "You're absolutely right," I said quietly. "This is about dignity and respect for my father's memory." Isabella blinked, clearly caught off guard by my calm response. Marcus's hand tightened protectively on her back, as if he thought I might suddenly lunge at him. "I'm glad you understand," Helen said, though she sounded disappointed. "Family unity is so important during times like these." I nodded slowly, my eyes moving from Isabella to Marcus to Helen to James. Each face showed the same mixture of smugness and anticipation. They were all waiting for something, for me to crumble, to rage, to provide the dramatic finale to whatever narrative they'd constructed about my place in their newly wealthy world. But as I stood there in the rain, feeling the weight of that mysterious envelope in my pocket, something had shifted inside me, the part of me that had spent years trying to earn their respect, trying to prove I was worthy of Isabella's love, trying to apologize for not being the man they thought she deserved. That part was simply gone. In its place was something else, something colder, more patient, something that understood the difference between losing and choosing not to play. "I'll see you at the service," I said finally, my voice carrying a note that made Isabella's eyes narrow slightly. As I walked away toward the modest sedan that would carry me to my father's graveside, I heard Marcus say something that made the others laugh. But for the first time in years, their laughter didn't sting. It didn't matter. What mattered was the envelope in my pocket and the growing certainty that this funeral was not going to end the way any of them expected. The game was just beginning, and they had no idea they were already losing. The envelope felt heavier in my pocket as I sat in the back of the modest sedan, watching the cemetery fade behind us. The other passengers, distant cousins whose names I barely remembered, made polite conversation about my father's long life and peaceful passing. I nodded at appropriate intervals, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene at the limousine with growing clarity. It wasn't just the celebration that disturbed me, it was the confidence, the absolute certainty in their voices when they talked about inheritance, about my father finally coming to his senses, about family finances. They weren't guessing about my father's will. They knew something. Back at my house, I finally had a moment to examine the envelope properly. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, with my name written in my father's distinctive handwriting across the front. Inside, I found a single key attached to a small piece of paper with an address I didn't recognize, and beneath that, a brief note. "Richard, if you're reading this, then they've already started lying. The safety deposit box will tell you everything. Trust no one else. Dad." The safety deposit box was at a bank I'd never heard of, located in a part of town I rarely visited. The elderly clerk who helped me seemed to be expecting my arrival, which struck me as odd until I realized my father must have made arrangements in advance. What I found inside changed everything. There were documents dating back 3 years, private investigator reports, photographs, bank statements, and most damning of all, copies of emails between Isabella and her family that made my blood run cold. But it was the letter on top, addressed to me in my father's handwriting, that made me understand the full scope of what had been happening in my own home. "Richard," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone and they'll have made their move. I've known about Isabella's affair for 3 years now. I've known about her family's plans for almost as long. What you don't know is how deep this betrayal goes, or how carefully they've been planning your destruction." I had to read that sentence 3 times before it fully sank in. 3 years. My father had been watching my wife systematically betray me for 3 years, and he'd said nothing. At first, I felt a surge of anger. Why hadn't he warned me? But as I continued reading, I began to understand. "I wanted to tell you immediately," the letter continued, "but I realized that wouldn't protect you from what they were really planning. Isabella isn't just having an affair, son. She's been working with her family to position herself as your caretaker, to have you declared incompetent when the time comes to inherit my estate. They've been building a case that you're emotionally unstable, financially irresponsible, and incapable of managing significant assets." My hands were shaking as I turned the page. This wasn't just adultery. This was a long-term conspiracy designed to steal my inheritance by destroying my reputation and mental health. "The private investigators' reports will show you the extent of their planning," the letter went on. "Isabella has been systematically isolating you from friends and extended family. She's been documenting every moment of frustration you've shown, every raised voice, every sign of stress, and presenting them to a psychiatrist as evidence of mental illness. Her brother James has been working with a lawyer to prepare conservatorship papers." I thought back over the past 3 years, remembering incidents that had seemed like normal marital friction at the time. Isabella's insistence that I stop playing poker with my college friends because it was addictive behavior. Her suggestion that I see a therapist for anger management after I'd raised my voice during an argument about her spending. The way she'd started recording our conversations on her phone, claiming it was to help us communicate better. Every memory took on a sinister new dimension. She hadn't been trying to help our marriage. She'd been building a legal case against me. The photographs were worse than the written reports. There were pictures of Isabella and Marcus together dating back 4 years, not the 6 months I'd suspected. Pictures of them house hunting in expensive neighborhoods, pictures of Isabella at lunch with lawyers, signing documents I'd never seen, but the bank statements were what made me physically sick. For the past 2 years, Isabella had been withdrawing money from our joint account, small amounts, never enough to trigger my attention, but adding up to nearly $15,000, money that I'd assumed was going toward household expenses or her book club activities, had actually been funding her secret life with Marcus. There were receipts for hotel rooms, expensive dinners, and shopping trips that coincided with days when she'd told me she was visiting her sick friend in the next town over. There were credit card statements for cards I didn't even know existed, all in my name, showing purchases of jewelry and lingerie that I'd never seen her wear. I was sitting in my father's favorite chair, surrounded by evidence of my wife's betrayal, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Richard Covington? The voice was professional, crisp. This is Margaret Chen from Patterson, Chen & Associates. I was your father's attorney. I believe we need to meet immediately. The law office was located in the financial district, in one of those glass towers that made me feel underdressed even when I was wearing my best suit. Margaret Chen was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. She shook my hand with a firm grip and gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing her massive oak desk. First, she said without preamble, let me express my condolences for your loss. Your father was a remarkable man and a careful planner. She opened a thick file folder and pulled out a document I recognized as a will. Second, I need to inform you that what happened at the funeral today was based on fraudulent information. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? Your father suspected that your wife and her family might try to interfere with his estate planning. About 6 months ago, he asked me to create 2 versions of his will. One was a decoy designed to look official, but containing false information about his assets and beneficiaries. The other is the real document, which only you and I know about. She slid the decoy will across the desk. I read it quickly, my heart sinking with each line. According to this version, my father had left everything to Isabella, with a note stating that he had lost confidence in Richard's ability to manage family assets responsibly. There was even a paragraph about my recent struggles with emotional stability and financial judgment. This is the version that Isabella somehow obtained, Margaret continued. Probably through theft, though we can't prove that yet. She's been showing it to people for the past week, claiming it's the official will. But it's not real? Absolutely not. Margaret pulled out another document, this one bearing official seals and notarization marks. This is your father's actual will, executed just 3 months ago. You, Richard, are the sole beneficiary of his entire estate, which includes not just his house and savings, but several properties and investments that Isabella doesn't even know exist. I stared at the document, reading my name over and over again. How much are we talking about? Approximately $12,400,000 in total assets. The number hit me like a physical blow. $12 million. My father, the man who had lived modestly in the same house for 30 years, who drove a 10-year-old car and clipped coupons from the Sunday paper, had been worth $12 million. But there's more you need to know, Margaret said, her expression growing darker. Your father didn't just suspect Isabella was cheating on you. He had proof, and he discovered that she and her family were planning to have you declared mentally incompetent so they could control your inheritance through a conservatorship arrangement. She handed me another folder, this one containing psychiatric evaluations that I'd never agreed to participate in. Evaluations based on observations provided by Isabella and her family, painting me as a man suffering from depression, anxiety, and financial delusions. They were going to wait until after the funeral, Margaret explained, for once Isabella was presumably in control of your father's money, they planned to have you committed for psychiatric evaluation. With these fabricated reports and Isabella's testimony about your deteriorating mental state, they probably would have succeeded in having a court-appointed conservator take control of your affairs. I thought about Isabella's behavior over the past few months, the concerned conversations about my stress levels, her suggestions that I might benefit from professional help, the way she'd started treating me like an invalid who couldn't be trusted with important decisions. "She's been playing a long game," I said slowly. "Very long, and very carefully planned, but your father was smarter than they gave him credit for." Margaret smiled for the first time since I'd entered her office. "The question now is, what do you want to do about it?" I sat back in the leather chair, my mind racing. Isabella and her family thought they'd won. They were probably at my house right now, going through my father's papers, planning their next moves, celebrating their victory over the weak, emotionally unstable husband who was about to lose everything. They had no idea that their carefully constructed plan was built on a foundation of lies, and that the real will, the one that mattered, gave me not only financial freedom, but the power to decide how this story would end. I looked at Margaret Chen, this woman who had helped my father protect me even after his death, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: control. "I want to give them exactly what they expect," I said finally. "For now." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You want to let them believe they've succeeded? I want them to show me exactly who they really are. I want to see how far they'll go when they think they've won." I stood up, tucking the real will into my jacket pocket next to my father's letter. "And then I want to watch their world collapse when they realize they never had any power at all." For the first time in 3 years, I was the one with the secret, and unlike my wife, I knew how to be patient. When I walked through the front door of my house that evening, the atmosphere hit me like a wall of expensive perfume and barely contained excitement. Isabella was in the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in the animated tone she reserved for good news. Through the archway, I could see Helen and James seated at the dining room table, papers spread before them like battle plans. "Yes, the reading's scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10, Isabella was saying. "No, there shouldn't be any problems. Richard doesn't even know about the other properties." She laughed, a sound that would have warmed my heart 6 months ago, but now made my skin crawl. "Trust me, by this time next week, we'll have everything sorted out." She noticed me standing in the doorway and quickly ended her call. "Richard, honey, you're home. How are you feeling? Today was so difficult for all of us." The concern in her voice was perfectly modulated, practiced. I wondered how long she'd been rehearsing that tone. The caring wife worried about her grieving husband's mental state. Margaret Chen's words echoed in my mind. They were building a case for my incompetence. "I'm managing," I said quietly, which was true in ways she couldn't imagine. "What's all this?" I gestured toward the dining room where Helen and James were pretending to read sympathy cards while clearly eavesdropping on every word. "Oh, we're just trying to help organize things for tomorrow. Your father's will reading, the funeral arrangements, all those details that can be so overwhelming when you're grieving." Isabella's hand found my arm, her fingers cool against my skin. "Why don't you sit down? You look exhausted. I can make you some tea." Tea. She'd been pushing tea on me for months, always insisting I finish the cup even when it tasted bitter. I thought of the psychiatric reports in Margaret Chen's office, the ones documenting my alleged paranoia and anxiety. Had she been drugging me? The thought should have shocked me, but after everything I'd learned, it seemed almost inevitable. "That's very thoughtful," I said, "but I think I'll just go upstairs and rest for a while." Isabella's smile flickered for just a moment. "Are you sure? We really should discuss some practical matters. There are going to be decisions to make, paperwork to handle. I don't want you to worry about any of it, but we should talk about how we're going to manage everything." How we were going to manage everything, as if there was still a we in any meaningful sense. James cleared his throat from the dining room. "Richard, why don't you join us? We're trying to get a handle on your father's affairs. There are some questions only you can answer." I could see the trap being laid. They wanted me involved just enough to sign whatever documents they'd prepared, but not enough to actually understand what I was signing. They needed my cooperation to make their plan work, which meant they had to maintain the illusion that I was still part of their decision-making process. "Of course," I said. settling into one of the dining room chairs. I want to help however I can. Helen looked up from a stack of papers, her pale eyes studying my face with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. Richard, dear, I hope you understand that we're only trying to help. Managing an inheritance can be so complicated, especially when there are tax implications and legal requirements. Isabella and James have been researching the best ways to handle everything. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral while internally marveling at her audacity. They were discussing my inheritance, money that was rightfully mine, as if I were a child who needed adults to make decisions for him. James spread out what appeared to be legal documents across the table. We've been in touch with an estate planning attorney. She says there are several steps we need to take immediately to protect the assets from unnecessary taxation and legal complications. I recognized one of the documents from Margaret Chen's files. It was a power of attorney form that would give Isabella complete control over my financial affairs. Another was a medical directive that would allow her to make healthcare decisions on my behalf if I was deemed unable to do so myself. This all seems very thorough, I said carefully. But shouldn't we wait until after the official will reading tomorrow before making any major decisions? The three of them exchanged glances so quickly I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching for exactly that kind of coordination. They knew something about tomorrow's will reading that they thought I didn't know. Well, Isabella said, her voice taking on that patient tone people use with confused elderly relatives. The thing is, your father's attorney already gave us a preliminary overview of the will's contents. It's just a formality at this point. Just a formality. They were so confident in their fraudulent document that they'd already moved past pretending it might contain surprises. I see, I said. And what did this preliminary overview reveal? Helen reached across the table and patted my hand with the kind of condescending gentleness that made my jaw clench. Richard, your father was very concerned about your well-being in his final months. He wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of, but he also wanted to ensure that the family assets would be managed responsibly. What Helen means, James interjected with characteristic bluntness, is that your father decided Isabella should handle the inheritance. He felt that would be the most stable arrangement for everyone involved. There it was, the lie delivered with such casual confidence that I almost admired their audacity. They genuinely believed they'd fooled not just me but my father as well. I have to admit, that's a bit surprising, I said slowly. Dad and I talked about financial matters fairly regularly. He never mentioned having concerns about my judgment. Isabella's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on my arm. Honey, you know how your father was. He never wanted to hurt your feelings, but he'd been watching how stressed you've been lately, how overwhelmed you get with even simple decisions. He was worried about what might happen if you suddenly had to manage a large inheritance on your own. Stressed, overwhelmed, unable to manage simple decisions. Every word was another brick in the wall they'd been building around my sanity for months. I wondered if they'd practiced this conversation, rehearsed exactly how to present my father's supposed concerns in the most damaging way possible. That makes sense, I suppose, I said, injecting a note of defeated acceptance into my voice. If Dad felt that Isabella would be better suited to handle things, then I'm sure he had good reasons. The relief in the room was palpable. Helen actually smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness I'd seen from her all day. James sat back in his chair, his posture relaxing as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But it was Isabella's reaction that interested me most. Instead of looking relieved, she looked almost disappointed. She'd been prepared for an argument, for resistance, for the kind of emotional breakdown that would validate their claims about my mental instability. My quiet acceptance had robbed her of the dramatic confrontation she'd been anticipating. I'm glad you understand, she said carefully. I know this is a lot to process. Are you sure you're feeling all right? You seem different tonight. Different because I wasn't breaking down, wasn't raging against the injustice, wasn't providing them with the evidence of mental instability they needed to justify their next steps. I think I'm just tired, I said. It's been an emotional day. Maybe I'll have that tea after all. Isabella's face brightened with something that might have been genuine pleasure if I hadn't known better. Of course, honey. I'll put the kettle on right now. As she busied herself in the kitchen, Helen and James began organizing their papers with the efficient satisfaction of people whose careful planning had finally paid off. They thought the hard part was over. They thought I'd accepted my role as the weak, incompetent husband who would gratefully allow his wife to manage his affairs while he descended into whatever medicated stupor they had planned for me. Isabella returned with a steaming cup of tea that smelled of chamomile and something else I couldn't identify, something that made my suspicions about the drugging seem less paranoid and more like reasonable caution. "Drink it while it's hot," she urged, settling back into her chair with a satisfied smile. "It'll help you relax." I lifted the cup to my lips, inhaling the steam, then set it down without drinking. "Actually, I think I'm more tired than I realized. Would it be all right if we continued this discussion tomorrow after the will reading?" Another flicker of disappointment crossed Isabella's face, but she nodded. "Of course, you need your rest. Tomorrow will be another difficult day." As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I could hear them resuming their conversation in hushed tones. They were probably discussing their timeline, making sure all their documents were in order, coordinating their stories for tomorrow's performance. They had no idea that tomorrow would be the day their carefully constructed world began to crumble. In the privacy of my bedroom, I pulled out my phone and called Margaret Chen. "It's Richard," I said when she answered. "I've seen enough. I want to know exactly what happens when we reveal the real will tomorrow." "Are you certain?" Margaret asked. "Once we do this, there's no going back. They'll know you've been aware of their plan." I thought about Isabella downstairs, probably disposing of the drugged tea I hadn't drunk. I thought about Helen and James dividing up assets that had never belonged to them. I thought about Marcus, who was undoubtedly waiting somewhere nearby for news of his financial future. "I'm certain," I said, "but I want to do this right. I want them to understand exactly how completely they've lost." Margaret's voice carried a note of professional satisfaction. "Then let me tell you what I have in mind." As she outlined her plan, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. Not the sick dread that had become my constant companion, but genuine excitement about the future. Tomorrow, Isabella and her family would discover what it felt like to be the ones who didn't belong. Tomorrow they would learn that my father had been far smarter than they'd ever imagined. And tomorrow, I would finally stop pretending to be the man they thought I was and start becoming the man I was meant to be. The only question that remained was how gracefully they would handle losing everything they thought they'd won. Something told me Grace was not going to be part of their reaction. The will reading was scheduled for 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. Isabella had been awake since 5, moving through the house with the restless energy of someone trying to contain enormous excitement. She'd tried on 3 different outfits before settling on a conservative black dress that struck just the right note between grief and professional competence. The perfect costume for a new widow about to inherit a fortune. I watched her preparations from the bed, pretending to be only half awake while she applied makeup with unusual care. She was getting ready for the most important performance of her life, and she wanted to look the part of the responsible, caring wife who would reluctantly accept the burden of managing her late father-in-law's estate. "Are you nervous?" I asked, letting my voice carry just the right amount of anxious uncertainty. Isabella paused in front of the mirror, catching my eye in the reflection. "A little," she admitted. "It's such a big responsibility. I just want to make sure I handle everything properly, the way your father would have wanted." The way my father would have wanted. The irony was so thick I could taste it. My father had spent the last 3 years of his life documenting her betrayal and plotting to protect me from her manipulation. But Isabella believed she'd been so clever, so convincing, that she'd actually fooled the old man into disinheriting his own son in her favor. "I'm sure you'll do fine," I said. "You've always been better at dealing with complicated financial matters than I have." That much was true, though not in the way she thought. Isabella had indeed proven herself exceptionally skilled at financial manipulation. She'd been stealing from our joint account for 2 years while planning to steal an inheritance. worth $12,400,000. Helen and James arrived promptly at 9:30, both dressed in their most expensive funeral attire. They brought Marcus with them, though they tried to make his presence seem casual. He was introduced as a family friend who's been so supportive during this difficult time, but the way Isabella's eyes lit up when she saw him made their relationship obvious to anyone paying attention, which apparently I wasn't supposed to be. "Richard," Helen said, settling herself on the living room sofa with the air of someone claiming territory, "I hope you slept well. Today is going to be emotionally challenging." James nodded gravely. "These formal legal proceedings can be overwhelming, especially when you're still processing your grief. And if you need to step outside or take a break at any point, don't hesitate." They were laying the groundwork for my expected emotional breakdown. They wanted witnesses to see me become upset, confused, unable to handle the stress of learning that my father had supposedly lost faith in me. It would be perfect evidence for their incompetency case. "I appreciate that," I said. "I have to admit, I'm feeling pretty anxious about the whole thing." Isabella immediately moved to sit beside me, her hand finding mine in what appeared to be a gesture of comfort. "Don't worry, honey. No matter what happens today, we'll get through it together. I'll take care of everything." Marcus, who had been standing near the window, pretending to admire the view, turned to give me a smile that managed to be both sympathetic and condescending. "Your wife is an amazing woman, Richard. You're lucky to have someone so capable looking out for your interests." "Lucky to have someone looking out for my interests. The man who had been sleeping with my wife for the past 4 years was telling me how fortunate I was to have her protection. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive." We arrived at Margaret Chen's office building 15 minutes early. The waiting room was decorated in soothing neutral tones with classical music playing softly in the background. Isabella sat beside me, her leg bouncing slightly with nervous energy she was trying to hide. Helen and James flanked us like bodyguards, while Marcus positioned himself near the reception desk as if he were just another client waiting for his own appointment. At exactly 10 o'clock, Margaret's secretary called our names. We filed into the conference room where Margaret sat behind a polished mahogany table, several thick folders arranged before her. She was wearing a dark blue suit that made her look every inch the successful attorney, and her expression was professionally neutral. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret began. "Before we proceed with the reading of Harold Covington's will, I need to address some unusual circumstances that have come to my attention." Isabella stiffened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "What kind of circumstances?" "It appears," Margaret said carefully, "that there has been some confusion about the contents of Mr. Covington's will. I have been informed that certain parties may have been operating under false assumptions about the disposition of his estate." Helen leaned forward, her pale eyes narrowing. "I'm not sure what you mean. We were told that Isabella would be inheriting the bulk of the estate." "May I ask who told you that?" Margaret's voice was crisp, professional. There was a moment of silence before James cleared his throat. We saw a copy of the will. Isabella found it among Harold's papers." Margaret nodded slowly. "I see. And this document you found, did it appear to be official, properly notarized and witnessed?" "Of course it was official," Isabella said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "It was clearly Harold's will. He'd obviously decided that Richard wasn't capable of handling such a large inheritance responsibly." Margaret said, making a note on the legal pad in front of her. "And you felt confident proceeding based on this document you found?" I could see where this was going, and I had to admire Margaret's approach. She wasn't directly accusing them of anything. She was simply letting them explain in their own words how they'd come to believe they knew the contents of my father's will before the official reading. "We just wanted to be prepared," Helen interjected. "These matters can be so complicated. We thought it would be helpful to understand the situation in advance." Margaret nodded again, then opened one of the folders in front of her. "Well, let me clear up any confusion by reading the actual will, the one that was properly executed and filed with this office 3 months ago. Isabella's hand found mine again, squeezing tightly. I could feel the tension radiating from her body as Margaret began to read. I, Harold Covington, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. I leave my entire estate, including all real property, financial assets, and personal effects, to my son, Richard Covington. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the rapid breathing of the woman sitting beside me who had just watched $12,400,000 vanish from her grasp. "That's impossible," Isabella whispered. Margaret continued reading. "Furthermore, I want to state clearly that my son Richard has always been a capable, intelligent, and trustworthy man. Any suggestions to the contrary are false and malicious. I have complete confidence in his ability to manage this inheritance responsibly." Helen made a small choking sound. James was staring at the table as if the wood grain held the secrets of the universe. Marcus had gone completely pale, apparently realizing that his comfortable future had just evaporated. But it was Isabella's reaction that fascinated me most. She wasn't looking devastated or shocked. She looked furious. Her carefully constructed mask of grieving daughter-in-law was slipping, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "There has to be a mistake," she said, her voice stronger now, more aggressive. "The document we found was dated more recently than this. Harold must have changed his mind." Margaret closed the folder and fixed Isabella with a steady gaze. "Mrs. Covington, the document you're referring to was a decoy, a false will created specifically to test whether anyone would attempt to use fraudulent documentation to claim Harold's estate." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Isabella actually recoiled, her hand dropping from mine as if I'd suddenly become radioactive. "You're saying my father knew someone might try to steal his will?" I asked, injecting just the right amount of confusion into my voice. "I'm saying your father was a very careful man who took steps to protect his estate from potential fraud." Margaret's eyes never left Isabella's face. "The question now is how this false document came to be in your possession, Mrs. Covington." Isabella's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. I found it in Harold's papers. I assumed it was legitimate." "You found it?" Margaret repeated. "May I ask where specifically?" "In his desk, in the study." Margaret made another note. "Interesting, because according to my records, the only copies of that decoy will were stored in this office and in a safety deposit box that only Harold and I had access to. It was never taken to his home." The trap was closing, and I could see Isabella beginning to panic. Her carefully planned story was falling apart, and she was starting to realize just how thoroughly my father had outmaneuvered her. "There must be some explanation," Helen said desperately. "Perhaps Harold gave Isabella a copy to review to prepare her for the responsibility." "That's certainly possible," Margaret acknowledged. "Of course, that would mean Harold was deliberately giving her a false document while planning to leave everything to Richard anyway. That seems, unlikely." James was sweating now, his expensive suit looking suddenly rumpled. "Look, obviously there's been some kind of misunderstanding. The important thing is that Richard gets what's rightfully his. We never wanted anything that didn't belong to us." That was a lie so blatant it was almost funny. They'd been spending my inheritance in their heads for months, planning their new lives as wealthy people. James had probably already picked out the luxury car he was going to buy with his share. But Margaret wasn't finished. "Actually, there's one more thing. Harold left specific instructions for a secondary reading to be conducted only if someone attempted to use the fraudulent will." She opened another folder, this one much thicker than the first. "He wanted me to read this additional statement in the presence of anyone who had claimed knowledge of his estate plans before the official reading." Isabella was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "What kind of statement?" Margaret cleared her throat and began to read in a voice that carried the weight of judgment from beyond the grave. "If this secondary reading has taken place, it means that someone close to Richard attempted to defraud him of his rightful inheritance. To those people, I want to say this. I knew about your plans long before you implemented them. I knew about the affair. I knew about the forged psychiatric evaluations. I knew about the money stolen from joint accounts. And I knew about your intention to have my son declared incompetent so you could control his inheritance through conservatorship. The color drained completely from Isabella's face. Beside her, Helen made a small, whimpering sound. Furthermore, Margaret continued, and I have documented evidence of all these activities, which I have left in Richard's care, along with instructions on how to proceed legally if he chooses to do so. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd planned, everything they'd celebrated just 24 hours ago had not only disappeared, but turned into a potential criminal liability. Margaret closed the folder and looked around the table. That concludes the reading of Harold Covington's will. Richard, if you'd like to stay for a few minutes, we can discuss the practical aspects of managing your inheritance. Everyone else. She paused meaningfully. I believe you have some personal matters to sort out. Isabella stood up so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor. Her face was a mask of barely controlled rage, all pretense of loving concern finally abandoned. This isn't over, she said, her voice low and dangerous. I looked up at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in our 27-year marriage, I saw her clearly. Not the woman I'd fallen in love with, not the wife I'd tried so hard to please, but the stranger she'd always been underneath. Yes, I said quietly. It is. As they filed out of the conference room in stunned silence, I realized that the most remarkable thing wasn't that I'd won, it was that I felt nothing but relief. The war was over before they'd even realized it had begun. The silence that followed Isabella and her family's exit from Margaret Chen's office was profound, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, heavy with unspoken threats and barely contained fury. Through the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched them cluster in the parking lot below, their animated gestures and heated expressions telling me everything I needed to know about their state of mind. Margaret closed her folders with the satisfied precision of someone who had just executed a perfectly planned legal maneuver. How are you feeling, Richard? Relieved, I said and meant it, but also concerned about what they'll do next. Isabella doesn't handle defeat well, and she's had 27 years to study my weaknesses. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Your father anticipated that. There's more we need to discuss. Safeguards he put in place and evidence he compiled that you'll need to understand. She opened a different folder, this one containing photographs and documents I hadn't seen before. He was very thorough in documenting their activities. The photographs were time-stamped and professionally shot, clearly the work of the private investigator my father had hired. They showed Isabella and Marcus together in compromising situations dating back 4 years, but they also showed something else. Meetings with lawyers, visits to medical professionals, and financial transactions that painted a picture of conspiracy that went far beyond simple adultery. Your father discovered that Isabella had consulted with 3 different attorneys about having you declared mentally incompetent, Margaret explained, pointing to surveillance photos of Isabella entering various law offices. She was shopping for someone who would take the case based on the fabricated psychiatric evaluations. I studied the images, feeling a cold fury build in my chest. This wasn't just about stealing my inheritance. It was about destroying my freedom, my autonomy, possibly my entire future. If their plan had succeeded, I would have spent the rest of my life under a conservatorship, medicated and controlled while they lived off my money. There's also this, Margaret said, sliding a bank statement across the table. Your father had Isabella's financial activities monitored. The $15,000 she withdrew from your joint accounts was just the beginning. She also opened credit cards in your name and ran up debts of nearly $30,000. $30,000 in debt that I knew nothing about. Credit cards used to finance her secret life with Marcus while she systematically worked to have me declared unfit to manage my own affairs. What's our legal position? I asked. Strong, very strong. We have evidence of fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and potentially elder abuse if we can prove she was manipulating your father's medications during his final illness. Margaret's voice was crisp and professional, but I could hear the underlying satisfaction. "The question is, how aggressively you want to pursue this?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message. "Isabella, we need to talk. Come home immediately." I showed the message to Margaret, who read it with raised eyebrows. "Well, that was fast. They've regrouped and decided on their strategy, which is probably some combination of threats, emotional manipulation, and desperate bargaining. They're hoping to salvage something from this disaster, maybe convince you to give them some portion of the inheritance in exchange for a quiet divorce." My phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus. "Your wife is very upset. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The audacity of Isabella's lover texting me advice about how to handle my marriage would have been laughable if it wasn't so infuriating. I showed this message to Margaret as well. "I think," she said slowly, "it's time for them to understand just how precarious their legal position really is." The drive home took 20 minutes, giving me time to steel myself for whatever confrontation awaited. I'd lived with Isabella long enough to know her patterns. When cornered, she became either coldly manipulative or explosively angry, depending on which approach she thought would be most effective. Given the magnitude of her failure today, I suspected I was about to see anger. I was wrong. What I found was something much more dangerous and calculated desperation. Isabella was waiting in the living room, but she wasn't alone. Helen and James flanked her on the sofa like reinforcements, while Marcus stood behind them with his arms crossed. They'd arranged themselves as if for a business meeting, which I suppose this was, a negotiation for their financial survival. "Richard," Isabella began, her voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable and concerned, "we need to discuss what happened today rationally. I know you're upset and you have every right to be, but we can work through this." I remained standing, looking down at the four of them arranged in their careful formation. "Work through what, exactly?" "This misunderstanding about your father's will," Helen interjected smoothly. "Obviously there were miscommunications, but the important thing is that we're all family here. We can find a solution that works for everyone." Family. The woman whose daughter had been systematically betraying me for 4 years was calling us family. "What kind of solution did you have in mind?" I asked. James leaned forward, his expression earnest, in the way that usually preceded his most manipulative proposals. "Look, Richard, we know you're hurt and angry, but Isabella has been a devoted wife for 27 years. She deserves some security, some recognition of her contributions to your marriage and your father's care during his final years." Devoted wife, contributions to his care. They were actually trying to rewrite history while the evidence of Isabella's betrayal was still fresh in everyone's minds. "And Marcus?" asked quietly. "What does he deserve?" The question landed like a bomb in the carefully orchestrated conversation. Isabella's composure cracked slightly while Marcus shifted uncomfortably behind the sofa. "Marcus has been a good friend to this family during a difficult time," Isabella said carefully. "I don't see what he has to do with our discussion." "Don't you?" I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the gallery, finding one of the photographs Margaret had shown me. Isabella and Marcus kissing outside a hotel room 6 months ago. I held it up so they could all see. My father's private investigator was very thorough. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet in Margaret's office. This was the silence of people realizing they'd been caught in a trap they hadn't even known existed. Marcus was the first to speak. "Richard, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," I interrupted, "was thinking you were all smart enough to pull this off." I pocketed my phone and looked directly at Isabella. 4 years. My father documented 4 years of your affair, your financial theft, and your plans to have me declared mentally incompetent. Isabella's mask finally slipped completely. The concerned, reasonable wife disappeared, replaced by something cold and predatory. "Fine, so what? You were never going to divorce me. You were never going to stand up for yourself. You were just going to keep letting me walk all over you forever." There it was. The truth she'd been hiding behind 27 years of marriage. Not that she'd fallen out of love with me, not that she'd made a mistake, but that She'd seen me as weak and taken advantage of that weakness. She's right, Helen added, her voice taking on a nasty edge. You've been pathetic for years. Isabella deserves better than a man who won't even fight for his own marriage. James nodded in agreement. You can't just cut her off, Richard. She gave you the best years of her life. The best years of her life, while stealing from me, cheating on me, and planning to have me committed to a psychiatric facility. I felt something inside me settle into place, a cold, implacable resolve that surprised me with its strength. You're right, I said quietly. I should have fought for my marriage. I should have stood up for myself years ago. I looked at each of them in turn, but it's not too late to start. Isabella leaned forward, sensing weakness in my admission. Richard, honey, if you're willing to work with us, we can make this right. A fair settlement, a quiet divorce, everyone moves on with their lives. You don't have to be vindictive. Vindictive, I repeated. That's an interesting choice of words. I pulled out my phone again and dialed a number I'd memorized during the drive home. Margaret, it's Richard. Yes, I've made my decision. File all of it. The fraud charges, the identity theft, the conspiracy, everything. I paused, watching the color drain from 4 faces. And contact the district attorney's office about the elder abuse angle. If Isabella was medicating my father without his knowledge, I want that investigated too. Isabella lunged toward me, her hand reaching for my phone. You can't do this. Richard, please think about what you're doing. I stepped back, easily avoiding her grab. For the first time in our marriage, I was the one with all the power, and she was the one begging. I have thought about it, I said. I've thought about 27 years of marriage to someone who saw me as a mark to be conned. I've thought about 4 years of sleeping next to someone who was planning to have me declared mentally ill so she could steal my inheritance. And I've thought about what my father would want me to do with the evidence he spent 3 years collecting. Marcus stepped forward, his athletic build suddenly seeming less impressive and more desperate. Look, man, this has gone far enough. Isabella made some mistakes, but you're talking about destroying people's lives here? No, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. I'm talking about consequences, something you've all managed to avoid for far too long. Helen was crying now, her perfectly applied makeup running down her cheeks. Richard, please, James has children to think about. This scandal will ruin his career, destroy his family. Then you should have thought about that before you decided to destroy mine. Isabella made one last desperate play, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine emotion. Richard, I know I hurt you. I know I made terrible choices. But somewhere underneath all this anger, you still love me. You wouldn't be this upset if you didn't. I looked at her, really looked at her, trying to find some trace of the woman I'd fallen in love with 27 years ago. But that woman had been an illusion, a performance designed to hook a mark and keep him compliant while she slowly destroyed his life. No, Isabella, I said quietly. I don't love you. I haven't loved you for a long time. I just didn't realize it until today. The truth of those words hit me as I spoke them. The pain I'd been feeling wasn't heartbreak. It was relief. Relief at finally seeing clearly, relief at no longer having to pretend our marriage meant something it had never meant. My phone rang. Margaret's voice was businesslike and efficient. Richard, I've filed the initial paperwork. The authorities want to interview you tomorrow morning. Are you prepared for this to become public? Yes, I said, looking at the 4 people who had planned to steal my future. I'm more than ready. As I hung up, Isabella fell back onto the sofa, her face buried in her hands. The others sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that their carefully laid plans hadn't just failed. They'd become evidence in a criminal case that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. Not just from their manipulation, but from the burden of trying to save a marriage that had been built on lies from the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in decades, I was going to sleep peacefully. The game was over, and justice was finally beginning. 6 months later, I sat on the wraparound porch of my father's my country house now, watching the sun set over the lake he'd loved so much. The house was everything he'd described in his letters: rustic but comfortable, isolated enough for true privacy, but close enough to town for convenience. More importantly, it was completely free of the memories that had poisoned my life in the city. The legal proceedings had concluded 3 weeks ago. Isabella pled guilty to fraud and identity theft in exchange for a reduced sentence, 18 months in minimum security prison, followed by community service. Marcus disappeared shortly after the charges were filed, apparently deciding that loyalty to Isabella wasn't worth risking his own freedom. Helen was facing financial ruin from the legal fees, while James had lost his job when the scandal became public. But the real victory wasn't their punishment. It was the peace I'd found in their absence. I'd discovered things about my father's life that he'd never shared with me. The country house was just one of several properties he'd quietly acquired over the years. There was also a cabin in Montana, a small apartment in Paris, and a beachfront cottage in Maine. He'd been planning a very different kind of retirement than the modest one he'd pretended to envision. More surprisingly, I'd found journals dating back 20 years where he'd documented his growing concerns about Isabella. He'd never liked her, had never trusted her apparent transformation from the ambitious young woman I'd married to the supportive wife she pretended to become, but he'd also understood that I needed to discover her true nature for myself in my own time. The hardest thing about being a parent, he'd written in an entry from 2 years ago, is watching your child make mistakes while knowing that preventing those mistakes would rob them of the strength that comes from overcoming them. Richard is stronger than he knows, but he'll never discover that strength as long as I'm fighting his battles for him. He'd been right. The man who had meekly accepted Isabella's betrayal for 4 years would never have survived what followed. But the man who had emerged from that destruction was someone I was finally learning to respect. The financial windfall had been life-changing, but not in the way people might expect. Having $12,400,000 didn't make me feel wealthy. It made me feel free. Free to choose where to live based on what brought me peace rather than what I could afford. Free to pursue interests I'd abandoned during my marriage because Isabella had deemed them immature or impractical. Free to discover who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to earn someone else's approval. I'd started writing again, something I hadn't done since college. Nothing ambitious, just observations about lake life, memories of my father, reflections on the strange process of rebuilding a life from scratch at 57. I wasn't planning to publish anything, but the act of writing felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd thought was lost forever. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I'd blocked months ago, but which still appeared occasionally when Isabella used different phones to try reaching me. I'd stopped answering these calls, but something made me pick up this time. "Richard," Isabella's voice was subdued, stripped of the confidence that had once defined her. "Please don't hang up." I didn't hang up, but I didn't speak either. After a moment, she continued, "I know I don't have the right to call you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I threw away." "Do you?" I asked quietly. "I had a good man who loved me, and I treated that like it was worthless. I had a stable life, a future, and I gambled it all away for someone who disappeared. The moment things got difficult," her voice cracked slightly, "I destroyed 27 years of marriage for a man who wouldn't even visit me in prison." There was silence on the line. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her waiting for me to offer comfort, forgiveness, some sign that our shared history meant something despite everything that had happened. "Isabella," I said finally, "I hope you find peace. I hope you learn to be the person you were pretending to be all those years. But I won't be part of that journey." "I understand." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I needed you to know that you weren't the failure in our marriage. I was." After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness, thinking about forgiveness and healing and the strange paths that lead us to the lives we're meant to live. I didn't hate Isabella anymore. That had faded months ago, replaced by something closer to pity. She would spend years rebuilding her life from the wreckage of her choices, and that was justice enough. But more importantly, I no longer needed her acknowledgement of my worth to feel whole. The validation I'd spent decades seeking from someone who was incapable of giving it had become irrelevant. A knock at the front door pulled me from my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone. The house was deliberately isolated, and I'd been careful about sharing my new address. Through the window, I could see a woman standing on the porch, her silver hair catching the last rays of sunlight. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with Sarah Peterson, the librarian from town. We'd had several pleasant conversations over the past months when I'd come in looking for books about lake ecology and local history. She was perhaps 60, with kind eyes and the comfortable presence of someone who'd found genuine contentment in a simple life. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, holding up a covered dish. "I was making too much soup for one person, and I remembered you mentioning that you were still learning to cook for yourself." It was such a simple gesture, offered without expectation or agenda, that it took me a moment to respond. When had I last experienced kindness that didn't come with strings attached? "That's very thoughtful," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "Would you like to stay for dinner? I was just about to eat something that probably can't compete with homemade soup." Sarah smiled, and for the first time in months, I felt something stir in my chest that wasn't grief or anger or relief. It was possibility. We talked for 2 hours over soup and wine, about books and travel, and the peculiar satisfaction of watching seasons change from the same window every day. She told me about her late husband, a teacher who died 5 years ago, and about the quiet life she'd built around the library, her garden, and a small circle of friends who valued substance over appearance. When she left, she didn't hint about future meetings or make elaborate plans. She simply said, "Thank you for a lovely evening," and walked out into the night with the casual confidence of someone who knew her own worth. I cleaned the dishes slowly, thinking about the difference between loneliness and solitude. For most of my marriage, I'd been desperately lonely while never being alone. Now I was often alone, but rarely lonely. And when I was, it was the kind of loneliness that comes from having something good to miss rather than something toxic to escape. Later, sitting by the fireplace with a book I was reading purely for pleasure, I thought about my father's final gift. It wasn't just the money or the properties or even the evidence that had freed me from Isabella's manipulation. It was the example he'd set, the quiet strength of a man who'd planned carefully, acted decisively, and trusted his son to become the person he was meant to be. At 57, I was finally discovering what it felt like to live without fear. Fear of disappointing someone, fear of being abandoned, fear of not being enough. The inheritance had given me financial security, but the real treasure was the knowledge that I could survive anything, betrayal, humiliation, loss, and emerge stronger. My phone buzzed with a text message, but this time it wasn't from Isabella, it was from Sarah. "Thank you for tonight. If you're interested in that book club I mentioned, we meet Thursday evenings at the library." I looked around the quiet house, at the life I was building from scratch, and realized that for the first time in decades, I was excited about the future. Not because I'd gotten revenge on the people who'd wronged me, but because I'd finally learned to value myself enough to choose peace over chaos, authenticity over performance, and genuine connection over desperate attachment. The 27-year-old man who'd married Isabella Whitfield had been looking for someone to complete him. The 57-year-old man sitting by this fireplace had learned to be complete on his own, which meant he was finally ready to share his life with someone who could appreciate what he offered rather than exploit what he lacked. I typed back, "I'd like that very much." Outside, the lake lapped gently against the shore, and an owl called from somewhere in the darkness. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt truly at home. The inheritance my father had left me wasn't just money, it was freedom. Freedom from people who saw me as weak, freedom from relationships built on deception, and freedom to discover what genuine happiness looked like for a man who'd spent most of his life settling for less than he deserved. As I headed upstairs to bed, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. The face looking back at me was older, weathered by betrayal and loss, but there was something in the eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. strength, peace. The quiet confidence of a man who'd learned to trust his own judgment. Tomorrow, I would join a book club, not because I was lonely, but because I was ready to share the contentment I'd found. I would continue writing, continue exploring this new life, continue being surprised by the possibilities that opened up when you stopped trying to fix what was irreparably broken and started building something new. My father had been right about so many things, but especially about this. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the space to save themselves. Isabella and her family were still trying to salvage something from their old lies, but I had moved on to a truth that was entirely my own, and for the first time in 57 years, that truth was more than enough.